Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Senate will not pass another economic aid package unless it includes protection for businesses against lawsuits related to the virus. For analysis on this, I'm joined by Dan Abrams. He's the chief legal affairs correspondent for ABC News and founder of Mediaite and co-author of the new book, John Adams Under Fire. We'll talk about that later. I can't wait to talk about that. John Adams, the founding fathers fight for justice in the Boston massacre murder trial. Dan is, like everybody else, holed up in New York. Dan, for some other things, what do you make of Mitch McConnell asking for more liability protection?
Well, look, this is kind of like tort reform, right? What McConnell is saying is that in exchange for this next round, he wants to make sure there are protections in place for companies. So let's take a step back and talk about if that doesn't happen, where are we? And so the standard then becomes like in any other case, which is negligence. And there are going to be a lot of lawsuits. There are going to be people who were going to say that they were exposed to the virus, either by going to work or being at a particular place, et cetera. But the standard still requires a level of irresponsibility on the part of the person being sued. Meaning, if you just go to work and you happen to get the virus from someone else at work, that doesn't mean that the company is legally responsible for it. There still has to have been some sort of knowledge. There has to have been some sort of action taken or not taken by the company to hold them responsible. What McConnell is saying is, let's avoid all of that. We just want to basically immunize the companies moving forward.
Do you buy that?
I mean, look, it's really a very typical political argument, right? I mean, typically the right has been more supportive of tort reform, limiting the amount of money that can be available to people suing, for example, a company. Typically the left has been more supportive of the people who are doing the suing. So it becomes a fairly typical divide between Republicans and Democrats over an issue like this.
What is this going to do to the insurance industry? Is that going to change? Will new policies be written?
Well, the insurance industry, I think, is going to be a super interesting question coming out of this, which is, you know, when you talk about policies, right, and they have clauses in there which talk about force majeure, as we call it, an act of God today. Is this an act of God? Is this going to be determined to be something that was so unforeseeable that insurance companies shouldn't be responsible for losses, et cetera? That, no matter what passes or doesn't pass in the Senate, is going to be an issue moving forward. It's going to be a question of how much liability do insurance companies have for damages, for losses that companies have incurred based on the specific language in their policies.
This is going to be an upheaval in the legal system, is it not?
Oh, there's going to be litigation over this for years and years. And look, and you know, we're probably thinking about some of the smaller cases. There are going to be some really big ones, right? Some deals that got called off at the last minute, putting aside insurance for a minute. A lot of contracts that say, for example, you know, this contract is valid unless there is an act of God. And is this determined to be an earthquake, a tornado? Those are the typical things that we think of when that language is used, but there's going to be a major debate moving forward as to whether this applies or doesn't apply in terms of contracts.
And about privacy, are people going to sue over being tested at an airport?
Well, you know, that's going to be a tougher one. The government has a lot of authority and power when it comes to a health crisis. You know, I hear people saying that, you know, civil liberties are being impinged on, and maybe they are, but the Constitution's not absolute. The First Amendment isn't absolute. We have libel laws. Congress shall pass no law. Well, libel law is one of those laws. On the Second Amendment, we ban machine guns. The Second Amendment is not absolute either. And so there are exceptions in the Constitution, and one of them that the Supreme Court has ruled on in the past has been this question of how much power the government can have in a health emergency. And this is a perfect example of that. I think the more interesting legal questions about sort of the rights of citizens is going to come a little bit down the road. We're already seeing the first of these lawsuits. It's basically saying, for example, wait a second, state, how can you treat a drive-through differently than a religious station? And those are interesting lawsuits, but they're going to have to be specific. It's going to have to show uneven treatment. It's not going to just be able to say, my civil liberties were violated here, and as a result, I'm entitled to damages.
We've got an election coming. Do you see a lot of issues occurring there based on the virus? No voting by mail in some states. Will there probably no conventions, right? Probably no conventions.
Well, they'll have online. I would assume they'll have online conventions, right? It'll be a virtual convention that they'll have, but they won't have a live convention, I don't think, in the typical way. The interesting question, of course, from the election point of view, is going to be what happens if there's a second round of corona by then, if things haven't continued to decrease, and then do people not show up to the polls? And in certain states, there is no absentee ballots. And how do you deal with these questions? Because you can't just postpone the election. That would be, the president certainly can't postpone the election. So it's going to be, there's going to be some very tricky questions that come up as the election approaches in connection with the coronavirus.
Recently said that Trump would have better approval ratings right now if he hadn't tried to shift blame in this crisis and attack governors. Expand on that.
Look, I said this on my radio show that I thought that the president could have had a 60+% approval rating right now if he had been to this and just gone for supporting, unifying, not attacking, that this is an opportunity for a political leader in an environment like this. We all want our president to be the person we can look to for information. And there's a reason that the governors across the country, according to polls, are more popular than the president right now, because the vast majority of Republicans, Democrats, whatever they are, there's a sense within those states they're doing what they have to do what's best for us. And when the president engages in these fights with the governors, when he attacks people on Twitter, rather than in this time when the country is nervous and afraid, simply saying, I'm here for you. We're going to do everything we can. That I think that Trump supporters in particular should feel like it was an opportunity lost for the president to really emerge from this even more popular than he had been before. And now he's back exactly to where he was, maybe even a little bit lower.
All right, let's turn to your book. Before he became the second president of the United States, John Adams was a distinguished lawyer in Boston. Now, what was this case, the Boston Massacre?
This was a case where British soldiers in 1770 fired on American colonists and killed 5 of them. And as you can imagine, this is a time right before the Revolution when tensions are high. And the colonists wanted justice, otherwise known as revenge. They were angry. They were furious at what the soldiers had done. And John Adams took the very unpopular case of representing the British soldiers at trial. And there were actually 2 cases, one of the captain, one of the 8 soldiers. He represented them in both cases. And I think became one of the most important moments in his legacy. We used a transcript from those trials. Actually, someone had been handwriting what had happened in court to tell the story of the Boston Massacre trials in this book.
Did they hire Adams, or did he volunteer to do this?
It's a good question. He was hired, and he was later frustrated that he felt he was paid appropriately. And, without giving it all away, I'll tell you that the captain is found not guilty, and Adams said that he later bumped into him in London, and the captain basically ignored him and was not appropriately appreciative, either psychologically or financially, for the amazing thing that Adams did in helping to get the captain acquitted.
Wow.
The case of the soldiers was a much more complicated case because it became clear the captain had not given the order to fire.
I can't wait to read this book. John Adams is a fascinating character in American history. Like the Bushes later, his son became president. He was also, was he brighter than most, or he thought he was brighter than most?
He was brighter than most, and he thought he was brighter than most. So it's both are true. He definitely had a very high self-esteem when it came to his intellect, but he was also a very smart guy. He was also a very difficult guy. And I think that, you know, as president, there were certain mistakes that he made. There were certain things he did very well, but he really, I think, is underappreciated, and he felt this way too, for what he did in this case, for taking on such an unpopular case. And what he did is he also did not attack the citizens of Boston. Someone else in his position might have felt the only way to win this is to really place the blame on them, because it was a self-defense case. Adams walked a very fine line in this trial of, on the one hand, saying it was self-defense, there was nothing else they could do, but being very specific about the blame without sort of casting a wider net, which also would have made him even more unpopular in that area at the time.
His wife, Abigail, right, was a very important figure in the early American history.
And the letters that she wrote, the letters between them, are some of the greatest historical artifacts that we have. I mean, you know, we don't have George Washington's letters with his wife. We have some letters from Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, but we don't have the kind of treasure trove of exchanges that we have between Abigail Adams and John Adams that range from the political to the personal. And she was, I think if she were alive today, she would be running for office herself and pretty darn successful at it.
Dan, I can't wait to read this book. Thank you so much for being with us.
Larry, always great to see you and great to be with you.